Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing as well as analysing tech news, which as usual, has popped up the past 24 or so hours. Hopefully you are having an amazing day. We have lots of news to get through in this particular video, but I want to start things out with a Ryzen 4000, which is codenamed Vermeer, which of course will be powered by the Zen 3 processor architecture, which will have, naturally, numerous enhancements over Zen 2. I'm hearing that we're going to see a pretty sizable IPC gain. I'm hearing around 15% on average. Same number of processor cores, of course, and it will, of course, also be on the AM4 platform. But what I want to focus here is on the release date, because DigiTimes have put out a report which tells us that these processors will be expected in September, and this report is actually being backed up by Computerbase as well. This is way earlier, quite frankly, than what I had anticipated for a couple of reasons. For one, Lisa Su herself has said in an interview that Zen 3 Desktop will launch the latter part of this year. Of course, the latter part is not exactly specific. September could be latter, but the way she phrased it, it did seem to indicate that it would be Q4. And this also seemed to be asserted during the Financial Analyst Day, which took place recently in March. Furthermore, my own sources seem to indicate that Q4 is a pretty safe bet. Indeed, there was also a recent tweet from a very well-known leaker on, well, Twitter, 0x22h, and he stated that AMD have actually delayed the release of both its CPU and GPUs, but the original release date was apparently October. So, is DigiTimes wrong? Are we going to see the CPUs launch at the latter part of this year? Well, quite frankly, obviously only AMD really knows for certain, and once again, to give DigiTimes the benefit of the doubt, their sources are generally pretty accurate. However, here, September does seem awfully early, especially with cough 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 that's going around. It just kind of feels like it would be just a little bit optimistic. And now we're going to shift over to Intel, as there is actually a couple of very interesting things floating around for Intel, the first of which concerns their Xe GPU architecture. Xe is of course a discrete-based GPU and will have several different usages, one of course for games, and the other is high-performance computing. There has been a very interesting discovery by Komachi on Twitter, which is for the Programmer's Reference Manual. And, well, the Programmer's Manual obviously needs to be inclusive of changes for future architectures, and it says, signal that is high on every EU block where the EU send pipeline is actively executing a Gen ISA instruction updated event to include new Stysolic pipeline addition on EU from Gen 12 HP onwards. HP, of course, a reference for high performance. There are also several other mentions in the very same Programmer's Manual. For those who have not been keeping up with Intel Xe, it is, of course, Intel's first major push towards discrete graphics. I mean, yes, technically there was Larrabee, but it was handled very differently from this. And ultimately, Intel are planning to take on Nvidia as well in the data center, but also AMD and Nvidia, of course, in gaming. Well, actually, to be technically accurate, AMD are making significant strides in the data center as well. But what we have learned through released drivers, which was last year, Intel's Xe architecture were comprised of several different GPUs. There was a low-power dev GPU, which we have seen in the wild. There have been numerous benchmarks of it, but ultimately it is significantly pared back in the amount of performance it has compared to the higher-end GPUs. The architecture is very similar, but the actual performance is pared back significantly. The idea here is that developers can essentially plonk this GPU into whatever system they're testing for, and they don't need to worry about running an Intel mobile based chip, and they can actually figure out what the GPU does, like what its features are, and so on and so on. But ultimately, it is significantly less powerful than the DG2 class GPUs, which have 128, 256, and 512 execution units. This is actually backed up by an article from WCCF Tech, where they claim that we are looking at an MCM type of GPU here, which can be made up of up to 4 tiles. Indeed, a few other websites had actually reported very similar things as what WCCF Tech had, so I'm fairly certain that this information is correct. But essentially you have 1, 2, and 4 tile variants. Obviously in this case, tiles is the number of dies on the GPU. So, for example, you can have 512 execution units, which would be what we think is 4096 cores, which would put out an awful lot of performance. It could be around 12 T-flops. And allegedly, we will see a single tile and a 2 tile variant for gaming, maybe, although that could be up to 300 watts. But the data center versions are going to be up to 4 tiles, and those will be several hundred watts to power them, so the likelihood is around 500 watts, but obviously, once again, to stress, these are not something you're going to throw into your household PC. These will be something that are used exclusively for the data center. Also, a very small update for Intel's CPU roadmap, and I'd also like to credit Komachi for this discovery, and also a couple of others who translated what these slides say. So basically, this is for future upcoming products for Intel, and seems to confirm that Alder Lake will be a 10nm desktop processor, although of course we knew this already. Tiger Lake will be 10nm, and will be a mobile processor. DG1 is a discrete GPU, I've just mentioned about that a moment ago. Ice Lake will be 10nm on Xeon scalable processors, and Snow Ridge will be a 5G ready 10nm SoC. It's looking like Alder Lake is going to be the latter part of 2021. Of course, the time frame is not exact right now, but Q4 is looking kind of likely, given, of course, Comet Lake will launch this year, and then at some point next year, Rocket Lake will be a thing. From what I'm hearing from a couple of different people, in terms of core count and raw performance, Intel probably will be rather competitive by around the time of Alder Lake or its successor. Until then, Intel will probably be taking a backseat on the desktop to AMD, with the exception of some workloads. I'm still hearing that Intel will probably be able to retain the gaming crown, but of course, you can make arguments of, yes, but it's gonna be sucking down more energy to do that. You can also make arguments, well, yeah, sure, but the 3900X is a really nice processor, and goodness knows how well the 4900X is going to be able to, run gaming and everything else. But the general consensus for what I'm hearing is that Intel will probably, generation after generation, manage to just about hold on to the gaming crown. Some workloads, it's going to depend heavily. If they really leverage lots of cores, obviously AMD are going to win. But probably in terms of value, and certainly in performance per watt, especially while they're on, of course, the Skylake architecture, there's a lot of ambiguity for Rocket Lake. What exactly is the architecture there? AMD will probably continue to be ahead. I'm also going to throw in a very interesting tidbit, and this is for Huawei, but no, this is not actually cell phone related. And I know that there is a lot of concerns over privacy and so on with Huawei, but this is actually intriguing because it's for the GPU. There is a report going around from Huawei Central, so obviously they're very, focused on a specific topic, let's just say that. But accordingly, They will be establishing a cloud and AI business group in South Korea this year, although once again timeframes are not exactly clear, and this is going to be for the GPU market. Currently, of course, Nvidia, as I mentioned a minute ago, does have a significant foothold on the market, but obviously both Intel and AMD are looking to kind of gobble up some of the GPU market, and also this is not exactly without precedent, because last year, I'm not going to read this verbatim from the website, Huawei unveiled its high-quality AI processor, Ascend 910, boasts speeds of 256 teraflops of performance. Will this gain any traction outside of China? I'm not certain, honestly. I kind of expect that a lot of large companies are going to be very happy to continue to leverage AMD, Nvidia, or of course Intel, but it's certainly in China themselves, I suspect that this is going to be really popular. What's also rather interesting, and I believe it was Amy that covered this maybe a couple of weeks ago, there was a report from some financial analyst. I honestly can't find it. I've been Googling for a while, and now I just can't find the bloody video she recorded it in anyway, but I know she did cover it, and that is that, according to a financial analyst, there is a fourth player that is coming in to the GPU arena, so I do wonder if they kind of had a heads up to this Huawei situation, or whether they are referring to another player entirely, which would mean it's a fifth player. And I'd also like to touch on a little bit of PlayStation 5 stuff. According to a developer, the PSVR needs to have an update, and this is from a developer which works at Endream. I'm probably going to butcher his last name, so I apologise. Patrick Lorname, excuse me. And he says that I think Sony knows that. This is in regards to an update to PSVR. If VR is going to continue beyond the next year or two, they need to update their hardware because it's dated, and it will be even more dated by then. I'd also be very surprised if they didn't continue to support VR, but I wouldn't expect it to be announced at the same time as the PlayStation 5. This year, the focus has to be on the core business, so I think they'll be doing all over the PS5 this year, and then, when that's solid, I think that's when you'll see what they're doing, end quote. To my knowledge, yes, the PlayStation 5 is getting an updated VR headset. Indeed, you can actually do some Googling yourself on this, and there are some patents. There's even one which hints that it has foveated rendering. I've mentioned this in a couple of videos previously, but long story short, it basically tracks what your fovea, hence the name, of your eye is doing. So obviously things which are falling inside your peripheral vision, it doesn't have to render in such high detail. That's a very pertinent patent. And to my knowledge as well, the geometry engine for the PlayStation 5 is going to be extremely useful for the PlayStation VR experience. That's one thing I have learnt. Speaking to a couple of developers, if you're a follower of me on Twitter, you'll know that I've been reaching out to as many people as possible. A couple of people have told me that the screen in PSVR is quite limiting at the moment, but also the performance of the base model console has been really hamstringing developers. Although things are still very early at the moment, so a lot of developers have not had that great of a hands-on experience with even the PS5 itself, so obviously things are still kind of up in the air. I can tell you the general consensus is that people do believe that the PlayStation 5 can handle ray tracing even in virtual reality, but obviously they may need to pare that back simply because of frame rate. But once again, I'd stress that a lot of this stuff is still kind of early. I'll leave you with one other small nugget for the PlayStation 5. You may recall recently I did cover the fact that the console had allegedly been overheating, and so I reached out to a couple of people and asked them if they'd heard the same thing. Is the PlayStation 5 overheating? And I got told very distinctly, no, it's not. I've actually spoken to a couple of other people since then, and pretty much the same thing. The console is definitely not having any thermal problems at all. It seems like it's a very stable to develop for and easy to develop for system. So that's definitely a positive. Indeed, from what I can ascertain, it's possible very early development kits for the PlayStation 5, or maybe even pre-development kits, which would be kind of internal testing units, did have overheating issues, or just thermal problems in general, or maybe stability issues. But that's kind of not surprising, because obviously they're testing the hardware. And clearly, when you're developing a system or any piece of hardware, this is whether it's a graphics card, processor, RAM, doesn't matter. You're going to have issues early on, because you may have like kind of buggy silicon, for example, or maybe problems with power delivery, or the cooling system's not implemented properly, or 1,000 other things, which basically mean that the console doesn't run as it should. Don't forget that if you have kind of more unstable or lower quality silicon, and this is vastly simplifying things, one thing you can do is to crank more power into it. So let's say, for the sake of argument, they had a piece of silicon that wasn't stable because it was early at a particular speed. They could maybe crank more power into it just to do some actual testing of physical silicon, and it could cause things like heat problems, because obviously you're plowing more power into the APU than maybe what it was originally intended for. But this is just the bring up of a system. So to my knowledge, at the moment, the PlayStation 5 is doing extremely well. And I'm also going to touch on something else, which is actually Xbox related. A number of people have been asking me if the Xbox, if there's any chance at all the Xbox Series X will see bumped specifications. Quite frankly, I have no idea for that. One thing I can say is that it's not outside the realms of possibility that Microsoft could crank the GPU specifications up by simply cranking up the clock frequency. I say that without someone telling me that they have done it. But all I can say is that it's definitely still possible. I do know that it's possible for both Microsoft and Sony to still alter the specs of the machine by increasing clock frequency. So one very easy win for Microsoft would be to say, hey, you know what? We're going to raise the clock frequency of our GPU by, I'm just pulling a figure out my butt, let's say 100 megahertz. And that would be very interesting in terms of raw performance of the system. The only reason I say that they might be able to do this, other than the fact that I've gotten told that it's still possible because the hardware isn't in final revision yet, is one, they've done it in the past with the Xbox One, and two, Phil Spencer has gone on record, as well as other folks at Microsoft, and said specifically that the console is actually ridiculously quiet. So maybe they may decide to say, 1 or 2 extra dB in terms of noise levels is worth it to crank up the clock frequencies a bit. I would not pin your hopes on this, without any question. This is just speculation on my part. However, who the hell knows what's going to happen in the long term. And I'd be very interested to see what would happen if Microsoft could get the clocks up to, let's say, 1900 megahertz. Speaking of Xbox, I've been working on a couple of very interesting Xbox videos, and a couple of very interesting PlayStation things, and also a couple of very interesting PC things. So if you would like more stuffs, then you know what to do. Subscribe to the channel. But I am going to get going because I have to do some more work with some other bits and pieces. And then later on this evening, I'm going to play Final Fantasy VII, as my pre-order has finally been delivered from Amazon. And I was literally like at the window at one point, like, come on, give me the parcel, damn it, I need it. Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to playing that later on today. But with all that said, take care of yourselves, guys. Bye for now.